So, for those who don't know yet, Audrius Beinorius will be or already is, the visiting professor of East Asian religions in University of Tartu for this year in spring semester and in the fall semester. Back in Vilnius University, where he has taught for some time, I don't know how long, he's the professor of Indian and Buddhist studies, but as you can see, he has other interests as well. So I'll let you continue from here.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's my pleasure and honor to start some lectures this semester and autumn semester at Tartu University. Myself, mostly working in the field of Asian studies. Still, I teach some courses that are very similar to what Indrek is doing, exactly methodologies of religious studies and our history of religious studies. So, and I was asked to offer some topics, some lectures. And one of such lectures would be, let's say, psychoanalytical approach to religious studies from the history of the perspective of history of psychology of religion. So, and would like to start my presentation from a brief introduction that psychological study of religion actually has emerged out of shadowy past that long antecedes the formal history. The beginning of the field as the formal discipline are sometimes dated to 1881, when Stanley Hall gave a public address in Boston on moral and religious education. Pioneers of new discipline, psychology of religion, mainly Wilhelm Wundt, Stanley Hall, Edwin Starbuck, James Loba, William James, especially William James sometimes is called as the father of psychology of religion, all considered Homo religiosus as a fully conscious being and the mind as the most important part of man's mental equipment. In the beginning of 20th century, according to Sir John Adams, a war has been started against consciousness. By perceiving consciousness as merely the tip of the huge mental iceberg, beneath of which there is a hidden motivational power, subconscious or unconscious mind, inaccessible to direct investigation. So in-depth psychology or psychoanalysis was a new and serious attempt to revolutionize the study and experience of religion. So, psychoanalysis as a set of theories and therapeutic techniques related to the study of the unconscious mind, which together form a method of treatment for mental health disorders. The discipline was established in the early 1890s by Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud and stemmed partly from the clinical works of Joseph Breuer and others. Freud first used the term psychoanalysis in 1896. So we have a map, so-called Freudian map of human mind, iceberg model with all three levels, conscious level, preconscious and unconscious, including a very important level ID, that is actually container of the unconscious desires. Two most important being eros and thanatos, instinct for life and instinct for death. Actually, we can say that from Freudian perspective, these two instincts are basic motivational powers, unconscious motivational powers. So, and Freud argued that religion represented a phase in the evolution of the psyche. His psychoanalytic perspective viewed religion as the unconscious mind's need for wish fulfillment. Because people need to feel security and to absolve themselves of their own guilt, Freud believed that they choose to believe in God, who represents a powerful father figure. In Obsessive Actions and Religious Practices, in one of his earliest works about religion, Freud suggests that religion and neurosis are similar products of the human mind. Neurosis, with its compulsive behavior, is an individual religiosity. And religion, with its repetitive rituals, is a universal obsessional neurosis. That's his famous expressions, famous sentences. Links between religious behavior and obsessive actions in sufferers from nervous affections. An example he provides is like obsessive hand washing. If ritual is not performed, we have a deep feeling of guilt. Another famous element introduced, or concept introduced by Freud, is Oedipus complex, directly related to the concept of repressed guilt. All neuroses have their origin in repressed childhood experience, entirely of sexual nature. Oedipus complex, repressed sexual desire of the mother on the part of a male child, and of the father in the case of female child, with consequent rivalry and jealousy of the other partner's sexual rights and privileges. Towards father, it's this mixture of feeling. It led to terrible act. Guilt passed on to all future generations. Repressed guilt in unconscious shows itself in religious behavior. In his famous work, Totem and Taboo, 1913, Freud analyzes the tendency of primitive tribes to promulgate rules against incest within groups named for totem animal and objects, and to create taboos regarding the actions, people, and things. He notes that taboos, such as regarding the incest, still plays a significant role in modern society, but that totemism has long been abandoned as an actuality and replaced by the newer forms. Freud believes that an original act of patricide, the killing and devouring of the violent primal father, was remembered and reenacted as a totem meal, mankind's earliest festival, which was the beginning of so many things, of social organization, of moral restrictions, and of religion. So, totemic animal becomes father substitute. It's a part of, or kind of animism. It means that totem animal becomes a god. So, we have several attempts of Freud to define what is religion, just providing his direct quotations. So we see religion is an illusion, and it derives its strength from the fact that it falls in with our instinctual desires. Illusion, which is perhaps the most important item in the psychic inventory of civilization. In another book, Moses and Monotheism, he says, religion is an attempt to get control over the sensory world in which we are placed by means of the wish world, which we have developed inside us as a result of biological and psychological necessities. If one attempts to assign to religion its place in man's evolution, it seems not so much to be a lasting acquisition as a parallel to the neurosis which the civilized individual must pass through on his way from childhood to maturity. Again, in his book, The Future of an Illusion, he says, our knowledge of historical world of certain religious doctrines increases our respect for them, but does not invalidate our proposal that they should cease to be put forward as the reasons for the precepts of civilization. On the contrary, those historical residues have helped us to view religious teachings, as it were, as neurotic relics, and we may now argue that the time has probably come, as it does in analytic treatment, for replacing the effects of repression by the results of the rational operation of the intellect. Again, from the same Future of an illusion, he says, religion is comparable to a childhood neurosis, or from civilization and its discontents. The different religions have never overlooked the part played by the sense of guilt in civilization. What is more, they come forward with a claim to save mankind from this sense of guilt, which they call sin. Actually, you can see that almost all definitions are very much similar, based on wish, desires, neurosis, guilt, and similar keywords. By the way, there is a famous quotation by the Freud, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. I don't know if you heard the context of this expression, because he was a heavy smoker of the cigars, and once he was asked why he smokes cigar, because cigar is nothing else, according to Freudian perspective, especially if you look to the analysis of the dreams, as a phallic symbol. And Freud answered, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. But keep in mind, the most important in this sentence is sometimes, only sometimes, not always. So what we see, how, I will not deal deeply with Freudian analysis, but wanted to show one example of a very close friend and student of Freud, Franz Alexander, who was trying to apply psychoanalytical methodology to the study of Buddhist meditation. And his famous quotation you see here, he says, Buddhist self-absorption is a libidinal, narcissistic turning of the urge for knowing inward, a sort of artificial schizophrenia with complete withdrawal of libidinal interest from the outside world. This is a narcissistic, masochistic affair that leads to asceticism, a systematic suppression of all emotional life. It is the pure narcissism of the sperm. So this is an example how he describes essence of Buddhist meditation. So, criticism. Freudian psychological explanation of religion builds partly on the idea of Ludwig Feuerbach, that God is projection of the unconscious mind. Freud added to this a psychological foundation by explaining that the adoption of religion is a reversion to a childish pattern of thought in response to feelings of helplessness and guilt. Second critical point, this is a lack of anthropological evidences and reliance on doubtful historical speculation. Many, even contemporaries of the Freud himself, have observed, for instance, Bronislaw Malinowski and in India, the first Indian psychoanalytic Girinchakar Bose, they made remarks on Oedipus complex, just telling that Oedipus complex is not discovered among Trobrians and Hindus. So that construction of, that is a European construction of the Freud. Another critics comes from a perspective of interpretation. So it is a naive interpretation of the empirical data by completely ignoring the vast field of world religious traditions and practices, its social, ethical, experiential aspects. Freud was not interested in this, and even his two works, Totem and Taboo and Moses and Monotheism, mostly dealing with religious issues, actually are having nothing to do with religious outside of Abrahamic context. I mean, Asian, South Asian, East Asian, and so on. Also, it is negative and dogmatic bias toward religion, described essentially as manifestation of repressed sexual drives. Impact, of course, was tremendous. And as Mircea Eliade once has remarked, that his two books, Totem and Taboo and Moses and Monotheism, became the gospels of 3 generations of the Western intelligentsia. However, we have later or post-Freudian developments, And what happens, it's an attempt to reconceptualize religion by later psychoanalysts. For instance, Donald Winnicott, so-called object relations theory, says religion helps humans adapt by offering comfort and familiarity. Again, Anna Maria Rizzuto, representing relational psychoanalysis, another branch, she says, the God representation is a dynamic process founded in early parental relations. Another, post-Freudian or later development, that's psychodynamic self-psychology, Heinz Kohut says, religion is not only an expression of the self, but also can sustain the self in the alliance between faith and grace with self-psychology and empathy. And finally, Erich Fromm, representing a cultural psychoanalysis, says religion helps people to find fellowships and some medicum of control over their lives and is thus a defense against feelings of powerlessness and loneliness. So what we see the later developments of psychoanalytical perspective much more positively looks to the religion. So that's why now we're shifting to the one branch or one later development, namely Jungian tradition, because that's my impression that Jungian approach was probably and still is much more fruitful comparing with other psychoanalytical branches. So the Swiss psychiatrist and psychotherapist Jung ranks as a major contributor to the modern psychological understanding of religion and religious experience. He was a member of Freud's early psychoanalytical movement. Jung read Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams in 19th, identifying delayed response in word association tests could be related to repressed wishes and traumatic memories, and sent a copy of his book to Freud. A book, namely Studies in Word Associations. And Freud encouraged Jung to meet him. They met together for the first time in 1997. And there is a story that they've been talking without any stop for perhaps 14 hours. So it means that they have some synergy, both of them. And fruitful cooperation started. Jung, in the beginning, ardently embraced Freud's conception of an irrational personal unconscious. However, he was unable to conceal his difference from Freud, that human motivation is exclusively sexual and unconscious mind is entirely personal and peculiar to the individual. So, Jung finally withdrew from the psychoanalytic movement in 1913. In publication of Symbols of Transformation, Jung deliberately repudiates Freud's theory of libido, which he did so in fear that would cost me my friendship with Freud. After the painful break from Freud, he underwent several years of auto-analysis, and in 1921 he published his first fundamental work, Psychologische Typen, which formed the basis for an independent psychological school of thought, nowadays called analytical psychology. So, as I said, Jung started from criticism of Freudian approach. Jung was consistently critical of Freud's materialistic reductionism, namely the attempt to explain the complex phenomena of psychological life in terms of biologically based wishes and conflicts of childhood. Instead, said Jung, psychology should seek to understand its subject matter consistently on its own terms. Jung viewed the religious impulse as sui generis psychological activity, and his conception of the unconscious was fundamentally different than Freud's. Jung subsequently proposed that sexuality is not the sole source of the psychic energy, but that libido is a general psychic energy which may flow in channels serving a range of instinct. And unlike Freud, who viewed most unconscious contents are the result of repression, Jung conceived of two strata of unconscious processes. The personal unconscious corresponded roughly with Freud's conception. So, Jungian definition of religion, again, providing just several definitions. We see already some differences. Religion is an attitude that involves a careful consideration and observation of certain dynamic factors that are conceived of as powers, spirits, demons, gods, loves, ideals, or whatever name man can give to such factors in his world, as he has found powerful, dangerous, or helpful enough to be taken into careful consideration, or grant beautiful or meaningful enough to be devoutly worshipped and loved. Two perspectives, fear and love. We have division. Another his definition, we may say the term religion designates the attitude peculiar to a consciousness which has been changed by experience of the numinosum. We'll come a bit later to this term, because this concept was very important in the general treatment of the religion by Jung. And one more definition, religion is an instinctive attitude peculiar to man, and its manifestation can be followed all through human history. So even in these three definitions of the religion, we see tremendous difference from Freudian approach. According to Jung, there is also a deeper transpersonal strata shared by all human minds that he referred to as the collective unconscious. That's perhaps the main innovation, you can say, made by the Jung. So the assumption of the existence of a collective unconscious is justified by two claims. First, highly similar mythical images and themes frequently recur at widely separated places and time around the world, with no evidence of cultural transmission. And second claim, individuals sometimes experience dreams and fantasies containing ancient mythic themes that cannot be accounted for in terms of the life histories of experiencing. Sometimes we experience something that cannot be explained on the basis of our own existing personal experiences. So the positing of the collective unconscious not only accounts for this reported phenomena, but also intimately links them to each other. Myth becomes a collective dream, and the dream a personal re-experiencing of the myth, both-sided impact. Language of the unconscious. The collective unconscious represents the deepest layer of the human psyche, which is formed from universal archetypes, complexes, and instincts-based forces, and is identical for all humans. This is a painting by Carl Gustav Jung himself from his so-called famous diary, Red Book. So, in this way, religion is an expression of the collective unconscious that is considered to be an oldest part of the mind. The collective unconscious reveals itself primarily in myth and fairy tales, whose analysis enables access to archetypal contents and appears primarily in dreams, literature, art, and culture. In this way, the language of unconscious are symbols and images because they exert a powerful influence on the conscious, in particular with a view to their numinosity. So, archetypes is a second concept introduced by Jung. So, the collective unconscious was not only the source and container of libido, sexual energy, but also the creative mythopoetic center of the psyche. It includes the archetypes comparable to Platonic ideas or Schopenhauer's prototypes, unlike the Kantian categories a priori, serving to structure psychological experience. From archein, original or old, and typos, pattern, model, or type. Through studying folklore, world mythologies, and the dreams of his patients, Jung identified these components of the psyche as expressions of instinctual patterns, or, he says, archetypes. Jung called them firstly as a primordial images, in that he considered them to be archaic or primordial types of universal images that date back to mankind's remotest beginning. Complexes. Complexes, according to Jung, are functional units of the personal unconscious and functions in the same way that archetypes on the level of collective unconscious. Jung viewed complexes as more or less unconscious psychic contents held together by identical emotion and a common core of meaning. He understood a complex as an unconscious focal point of psychic processes charged with a higher degree of negative or positive emotional energy. And a negative complex might be caused by a deeply felt emotional experience, a psychological trauma, or negative childhood experiences. Some of archetypes. The most important archetype, according to Jung, is self, the self. Jung referred to the self as supraordinate archetype, whose role was to regulate all other archetypes. The psyche is a self-regulating structure with conscious and unconscious processes, functioning in an ongoing, compensating dialectic. Jung imagined the self as a paradoxical symbol, as the center and circumference of a circle, a personal and impersonal, as a both limited and unbounded. The self for Jung was an archetype of wholeness and the organizing principle of the psyche. As he says, the self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of its totality, just as ego is the center of consciousness. These two illustrations, probably these two images, the best illustration of how Jung understood archetype of self. He says that in the philosophies of the East, he found what he interpreted to be a reference to archetype of the self. And the main source for him was Hindu Upanishads, and in one conversation he openly said that the idea of Atman, or divine self, Upanishadic idea, is a kind of prototype for the archetype of self. The multicultural symbolic expression of the self could assume many avatars. So archetype of self could manifest itself in different forms. The self was the source of the imago Dei, or God image, which could adopt many different forms depending on one's personal experience. Most important part of the human psyche that seeks integration and guides through the life. The self reveals itself in dreams and visions, figures of power, kings, supernatural entities, gods, outstanding religious personalities like Jesus, religious symbols, mandala. Second two archetypes, Anima and Animus, two primary anthropomorphic archetypes of the unconscious mind, as opposed to both the theriomorphic and inferior function of the shadow archetypes, as well as the abstract symbol sets that formulate the archetypes of the self. So anima is feminine side of the male, animus, masculine side of female. Man puts masculine characteristics into their persona and repress feminine characteristics. As Jung says, we are attracted to those who have the feminine masculine characteristics we personally repress. So, images of anima, for instance, Virgin Mary, Eve, Sophia, Isis, all Hindu goddesses, etc. Image of animus, Prometheus, hero, wise man, and many other examples. Jung wrote, every man carries with him an eternal image of woman. This image is fundamentally unconscious and imprint of those ancestral experiences of the female, a deposit of all the impressions ever made by woman. So, an anima is easily projected upon a woman. This is, by the way, contemporary illustration. In Hindu religion, there is an image, anthropomorphic image of the god called Ardhanishvara, half masculine, half feminine. That symbolizes, like in Chinese, yin-yang combination, this balance of the cosmic masculine and feminine powers. And you see this is a contemporary illustration, a woman dressed in two ways, half masculine, half feminine. That actually could be taken as illustration of this anima animus existing in all humans. Persona, another very important archetype. The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, a kind of mask designated on the one hand to make definite impression upon others, and on the other hand to conceal the true nature of the individual. The mask or appearance one presents himself to the world, the part of or those parts of our personalities which we think other people and society will like. It's a mistake. Will unlike should be written. We'll try like, because shadow we repress, and persona what we show, what we display to others. Also, the repressing parts of ourselves which we think are bad has negative effect on our mental health. And Jung says persona is a very fruitful source of neurosis. More we are pretending, more we are putting energy to display, to show ourselves in a particular way, more we become in danger of getting neurotic states. Jung explained, the persona, the ideal picture of a man as he should be, is inwardly compensated by feminine weakness. And as the individual outwardly plays the strong man, so he becomes inwardly a woman. It means the anima, for it is the anima that reacts to the persona. Persona is inseparable from shadow, as I mentioned. So, shadow, archetype refer to, first, an unconscious aspect of this personality which the conscious ego does not identify in itself. Or, second, the entirety of the unconscious, everything of which a person is not fully conscious. In short, the shadow is a dark side of the psyche. Also, the things we think society will not like and things that cannot stay repressed within us. We would like to repress, but sometimes we are not able. Shadow reveals itself in ideas such as Satan, Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein, and other images. Ashamed of our shadow, we project it onto something else. So all processes of demonization is nothing else, it's a projection of our shadow. Shadow constitutes part of our personal unconscious, but we also have an archetype shadow in the realm of our collective unconscious. And it represents an encounter with evil, and facing it can be a shattering experience. Jung made a distinction between archetypal events, archetypal figures, and archetypal motifs. So first of all, archetypal events. Birth, death, separation from parents, initiation, marriage, union of opposites. Actually, we can recall Van Gennep read the passage. Actually, all transformation we are passing in our life can be called as archetypal events, according to Jung. Second, archetypal figures, like great mother, father, child, devil, god, wise old man, wise old woman, the trickster, and hero. Figures that we have in all mythologies, in all fairy tales, in all contemporary cinema, you can say also. Archetypal motifs, such as apocalypse, the deluge, the creation, having some even cosmic connotation, you can say. So, although archetypes were never explained directly, they were knowable indirectly by the archetypal images they mediated in stories, arts, myths, religions, or dreams. Again, Jung stresses that number of archetypes is limitless. So nobody knows how many, and he said that future generations will discover more and more new archetypes. And at the same time, archetypes seek actualization within the context of an individual environment and determine the degree of individuation. So it's a kind of a map. Again, this is a problem. Jung himself never made an exact map of consciousness or even collective unconsciousness. We have many different versions, but in this you can see how we have different levels. Collective, unconscious, containing archetypes, great mother, self as the center of all our mind, anima, animus, shadow, much closer to the ego. And also we have persona in the middle, yellow. That is our self-representation to the external world. What is the role of ego? The ego in analytical psychology is the center of the field of consciousness and is also understood as the ego complex. The ego is a part of the total personality and the prerequisite of our ability to experience and reflect the world and ourselves. The symbol forming function of the soul and thus compensatory function can become effective only if it is comprehended by the ego. The ego should be in a compensatory relationship with the self, and a so-called ego-self axis should be formed. And according to Jung, the essential part of the individuation process occurs in the second half of life, which is marked by backward movement of the ego to the self, characterized by the broadening of consciousness and integration of the personality. What does it mean, integration, or as he says, individuation? In order to distinguish his psychology from the Eastern philosophies, Jung has introduced the idea of individuation. It means it is the process via which a psychological individual, through a progressive experiences of the archetypes and in particular of the self. So briefly we can say experience of the self, the aim and purpose. Individuation means becoming an individual, and insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. We could therefore translate individuation as coming to selfhood or even self-realization. We could also translate individuation as becoming undivided, becoming more and more of our own full self, having less of its projected or repressed or split off and denied. A major goal of Jungian individuation process was a progressive conscious experience of the activities of the archetypes, and in particular, the self, reflecting Jung's fundamentally religious views of the aim of a life. He viewed the life of Jesus as the cardinal example of individuation process. And he says also that individuation can be held back by parents, education, particular culture, and similar things. So the question is integration a religious process or not? Again, what we have, archetype of self and archetype of God are not easily distinguished. It's very difficult to distinguish these two archetypes. Secondly, both God and self belong to noumenon. It means it is impossible to understand or to describe both. Again, distinction between the God image archetype and God himself is evident. In the collective unconscious, there is only a God image. The question is, where is the God if we have only God's image in our innermost unconscious? Symbols of self and God are symbols of unity, such as a mandala. So mandala, according to Jung, represents unity of our all conscious, together with all unconscious content. Individuation is about wholeness and totality, but these are also the goals of religion. Jung's main concern was with the ways in which the God archetype had manifested itself in actual experience. That's why Jung speaks of self-integrating the shadow and relating in a new conscious way to the anima and animus. Very important in this experience is image. One of the Jung's important contribution to the psychology of religion was to recognize the primacy of image as the carrier of an affect. Jung's psychology of religion emphasizes the importance of embodying experience via encounters with integral imagery, as opposed to the theological abstraction of the Godhead. He recognized that the psyche naturally tended to concretize abstractions into images in order to experience them directly. Otherwise, according to Jung, one risks reducing religion to either ethereal abstraction or ritualistic behavior. That's why for Jung, faith was a cardinal tenet of psychotherapy, as it called on the ego to be transformed by its own death and resurrection. The Protestant theologian Rudolf Otto was an important influence on Jung's psychology of religion. Jung's idea of an experience of the self parallels Otto's description in Das Heilige of a transformative religious experience and is essentially a mystical one. This includes the strong effect that Otto referred to as numinous. During such a transformative mystical religious experience, according to Jung, the ego senses the self as both immanent and other, as outside the realm of description, irrational and proverbial. In following Otto, Jung termed this a mysterium tremendum et fascinans, famous keywords of Rudolf Otto, which is invariably characterized by surprise, awe, and fascination. However, both Jung and Otto agreed that the capacity to experience transcendent states was not an equally shared capacity, as a certain nonverbal affectual experience are rooted in prelinguistic activities of the brain that may vary among individuals. The archetypal character of numinous manifests itself in different symbols which occur across all cultures and express the relationship between the numen and human beings in again and again similar ways, like mandalas, crosses, etc. How numinous is experienced according to Jung? Jung defined numinous experience as inexpressible, mysterious, terrifying, and pertaining only to the divine. Religion, he observed, can be identified with a careful and scrupulous observation of the numinosum, a dynamic agency or affect not caused by the arbitrary act of will. It is an experience of the subject independent of his will, which causes a peculiar alteration of consciousness. Identified by Jung with experience of the unconscious, its deeply stirring emotional effect, trailing power, mana, psychic power, equated with holiness and heading or destructive qualities are unusually persuasive from the psychological point of view. These experiences, identified with experiences of archetypal images, understood as daimonia, can have a possessive or obsessive effect on consciousness. And one of the aims of individuation process is to strengthen, even to extend consciousness in the face of these numinous psychic forces. What the role he gives to the symbols? Analytical psychology assumes that the function of the self is to hold the dynamic totality of the psychic system together. If, for example, symbol of the self occur in dream, this may be seen as a compensatory act of the psyche aiming at healing a psychological crisis in the conscious. In the totality of self, opposites like good and bad, like light and shadow, are united. It is primarily the repressed or other unconscious contents which, in the presence of excessive one-sidedness, erupt into conscious in the form of dreams, images, or irrational. In the symbol, which has a central role in the analytical psychology, different aspects are drawn together. The Greek root symbolein signifies to throw together. Antithetical content, conflict, polar aspect, conscious and unconscious, transcendent function, past and future, myth and dream, form and content, inner and outer. The development of symbolic attitude is therefore of crucial importance in the process of individuation. In the religious dogmas and icons of the world religions, give expression to, refine, and elaborate, in one degree or another, the archetypes of the collective unconscious. This makes them suitable container for the complexity of individual human psyches. The archetypes underlying and supporting the religious dogmas and images are psychological forces. They behave like drives, but they are not just impulses. They are also represented as images in the psyche and can express themselves as ideas and ideologies. They have both spiritual and biological basis. Jung's writings on religion were primarily focused on the value and function of religious experience in the historical development of human consciousness, and particularly in the individuation process. Drawing heavily on Otto's account of Numen, identifying the qualitative, unique, non-rational mysterium tremendum and fascinans moment of religious experience. Jung celebrated significance of numinous experience for analytical psychology, but unlike Otto, located its source in the unconscious rather beyond the psyche. This is main difference between Otto and Jung, because for Otto, the source of numinous is on metaphysical or transcendental level, not in our deep and personal unconscious. Jung's approach to Christianity. During the last 2 decades of his life, Jung became increasingly preoccupied with the treatment of his own Christian tradition as a patient in need of psychological and spiritual healing, prompting his critics to charge him not only with heresy, but also with abandoning his own professed metaphysical agnosticism. Jung argued that Christ, the Western God image of the self, for the last 2 millennia, is incomplete. It lacks the tremendum moment of numinous experience equated by him with the divine shadow, and therefore fails to express the conjunction of opposites, the goal of the individuation process. Because integration of the divine archetypal shadow into consciousness is necessary for individuation, Jung thought to direct his readers' attention to the immensity of God, the conflict between his overwhelming light and dark aspects, arguing that contrary to the teachings of the Church, we have good reason to fear God as well as to love him. And because God is less conscious than man, he depends on man to integrate his opposites of good and evil, to integrate his shadow for him in order to achieve full consciousness, just as man reciprocally needs the numinous experience of God to transform his consciousness. So, the individuation and healing of God and man are codependent and realized only within human consciousness. That's why Jung's emphasis on wholeness also explains why he was opposed to the doctrine of privatio boni, that evil is merely the absence or privation of God, who, according to Augustine, is the all-good summum bonum. Jung believed that in order for the individual psyche to individuate, evil must be considered seriously as an archetypal force, as innate and fundamental both to creation and the individual self. He argued that good is meaningful only if we can contrast it with the equally palpable opposition and not merely with its absence. The splitting of good and evil predisposed the Christian psyche to difficulties in metabolizing negative affects, which were then repressed and embodied by what Jung termed shadow, a concept roughly equivalent to Freudian unconscious. Here also we have one famous quotation of Jung himself, as he said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That's why actually evil is the source of our awareness. If we are not aware of our darkness, of our evil, we cannot be fully conscious. That's why actually Jung suggested the need for quaternitarian God. What does it mean? Christ's figure lacks the darkness of spirit and is also without the sin. Without the integration of evil, there is no totality. According to Jung, the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, represents perfection, but not wholeness. This is because Christianity has recognized the need to face the question of human and cosmic evil, but has excluded and repressed evil from the presence of the Trinity. And Jung suggested that evil be included within the doctrine of God, that Satan be the fourth figure of the Godhead. Square, not triangle, you can say a simple way. And this is a problem all Christian history, that evil or Satan is excluded from this combination. And this would be pattern of completeness. Second very curious topic is Jung and Eastern religious tradition, because Jung was among those few Western European psychologists who were quite open, you can say, represented hermeneutics of openness toward Asian Eastern religious traditions. However, it's not so simple. So, Jung's dialogue with Eastern religious traditions spanning almost 50 years was profoundly influential on the development of analytical psychology, enabling him not only to discover cross-cultural confirmation for his clinical research, but also to extend his own meta-psychological conception. Based on the assumption that the Western consciousness is historically conditioned, geographically confined, and represents only part of mankind, he argued that Eastern psychology forms the indispensable basis for a critic and objective consideration of Western psychology. So we need very much Eastern psychology. Jung's primary interest was in yoga, but he used this term in a very broad sense. He was talking about Hindu yoga, Buddhist yoga, Taoist yoga. So he was talking not about particular Indian concept and practice, but used this term to describe all Asian spiritual religious practices. So he was interested in yoga as a natural process of introversion, seeing the inner processes to which yoga gave rise as universal and the indigenous method employed to achieve them as a culturally specific. The symbolism of Oriental yoga materials provided Jung with invaluable comparative material for the interpretation of the collective unconscious, assisting him in his endeavor to develop a cross-cultural comparative psychology of inner experience. So, the intention of his essays and commentaries on Indian, Tibetan, Chinese, and Japanese religious materials was not to invite his reader to uncritically adopt Hindu, Buddhist, or Taoist spiritual practices, but to demonstrate that the contemporary intrusion of Eastern spirituality into Western consciousness possess profound psychological significance. The Western discovery or rediscovery of collective unconscious, the source of religious experience. So Eastern traditions, or knowledge of Eastern traditions, actually is instrumental, as it helps us to understand or to get approach, you can say, to our collective unconscious. His research on Eastern religious traditions led him to realize that European alchemy, providing a bridge between analytical psychology and Gnosticism, is a Western form of yoga. Jung was drawn towards Eastern mystical traditions because of their dominant orientations toward overcoming severe imbalances between opposites, particularly spirit and matter, instinct and good and evil, causing disunity within the psyche and human suffering. Moreover, Jung was attracted to the emphasis Eastern yoga traditions place on detachment from egocentricity as the condition for the spiritual transformation of consciousness, because it provided a support for his affirmation that individuation requires the shifting of the center of personality away from the ego and towards the self. However, Jung's relation or interest or evaluation of Eastern religious traditions was quite ambivalent. In what sense? Observing that the mind of the Far East especially is related to our Western consciousness as the unconscious is, that is, at the left hand to the right, he understood the relationship between Eastern and Western mentalities and religious traditions to be one of the complementary opposites. He says, whereas Western man is predominantly extroverted, Eastern man is predominantly introvert. Actually, he started using in quite, I would say, rigid way these concepts, extrovert, introvert. and to apply to all civilizations, Western, Eastern, and so on. Actually, nowadays it's evident that there are fundamental differences, let's say, between Chinese religious practices and spiritualities and Indian, for instance, and so on. So actually it was a essentialization and oversimplification. But I will conclude with critical evaluation at the end. So, adopting a position of the East-West psychological relativism, he argued that whereas the introverted Eastern spiritual perspective searches for the riches of knowledge within the psyche, the extroverted Christian perspective is driven by the principle of love, which encourages worldly activity. The good example of impact of this extroverted-introverted opposition perhaps is Albert Schweitzer, who was also using in his works very often. Christianity is active extroverted tradition, Eastern tradition is introverted and passive. Again, whereas for the Western, the essence of that which works in the world of appearance, for the Indian, it is the soul, because he recognizes that the psyche alone possesses immediate reality. The world for him is a merely show or facade, and this reality comes close to what we see in the West would call a dream. Since 20th century, Western man is excessively, according to Jung, extroverted, suffering an unprecedented spiritual crisis because he has no time for self-knowledge. He is in need compensatory introverted spirituality to provide necessary psychic balance. And here, for Jung, lies the meaning of the West's engagement with the East during the 20th century. Exposure to Eastern traditions provides the catalysts for Western spiritual transformation. Here, the realization that the unconscious is the generator of consciousness. The West must approach Eastern values from within and not from without, building on its own psychic ground with its own methods to produce a Western form of yoga on the basis laid down by Christianity, rather than trying to cover its spiritual nakedness with the gorgeous but psychologically aligned trappings of the East. And Jung, for this reason, repeatedly warned against the practice of yoga by Europeans, a form of mimetic madness, as he said, which could, on the one hand, lead to the strengthening of the will and further repression of unconscious contents by consciousness, and, on the other hand, to psychotic states in which consciousness is overwhelmed by the unconscious. So, Western people should avoid yoga. Then what to do? Jung says that instead of practice of yoga, his own visionary techniques, especially technique of active imagination, could facilitate the flow of unconscious content into consciousness. Actually, so psychoanalysis, Jungian psychoanalysis, is a kind of Western yoga. Again, we should not forget Jung's objection to non-dualistic Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Why? Jung objected to the claim of the non-dualist Hindu and Buddhist traditions that the ego can be completely dissolved in or absorbed by the transcendental self. Doesn't matter how you call it, Brahman, Atman, Purusha, Nirvana, in a trance-like state, samadhi, attained by yoga practice. Jung considered that the practice of yoga can produce to a remarkable extension of consciousness, but it cannot lead to an egoless state, because there must always be something or somebody left over, some I, some observer has to be left. Otherwise, any mystical experience is impossible. That's why, for Jung, the infinite unconscious can never be fully known. He says that Indian yoga is nothing else like a metaphysical psychology, not empirical psychology, because we never can lose our ego. And for that reason, Jung insists that complete redemption from suffering in this world is an illusion, and complete liberation from the opposites means death. So what does it mean? It means that actually all Eastern practices, Buddhism, Taoism, and so on, is a kind of illusion also, because you never can get rid fully of your ego. Jung and Gnosticism. In response to persistent charges by his theological critics that he was agnostic, Jung insisted that he was neither agnostic nor a metaphysician, neither a theist nor an atheist, neither a mystic nor a materialist, but rather an empirical scientist and analytical psychologist. So, to be an analytical psychologist means to be an empirical scientist. Yet, Jung's enthusiastic engagement with Gnosticism spanned more than 4 decades. Jung's interest in Gnosticism arose as early as 1999 through his discovery that they were apparently the first thinkers to concern themselves with the numinous contents of the collective unconscious. The 7 Sermons to the Dead is the famous Jungian work, written in Gnostic spirit, in Gnostic tradition. And also below you see illustration, Philemon, spiritual guide of Jung himself, who had some Gnostic image, Gnostic connotation, who was his actually, yes, inner spiritual guide, you can say. Jung argued that the Gnostics anticipated and more or less prefigured the goal of analytical psychology, the individuation process, albeit expressed in a language suited to the age they lived in, and thereby demonstrating that the idea of the unconscious was not unknown to them. So Gnostics were the first analytical psychologists, even you can say. Jung always qualified his enthusiasm for Gnosticism, claiming that the Gnostics had no genuinely psychological conception of archetypal images. Rather, they projected their subjective inner perception into a cosmogonic system and believed in the metaphysical reality of its psychological figures. In other words, ancient Gnostics had not achieved individuation in the modern sense, but because they engaged with unconscious content more intensely than the most of Jungian contemporaries, their symbols and experiences provided illuminating comparative material, which could deepen Jung's clinical understanding of the unconscious. For Jung, all Gnostic images or symbols are expressions of the operation of unconscious psychic forces. Nevertheless, Jung's individuation process cannot be identified with the soteriological goal of Gnosticism, because Gnosticism we know only not as a philosophical system, but first of all as a religious system, having particular soteriological goal. Jung and alchemy. Originally, the processes of psychic transformation and physical transformation were amalgamated in the alchemical arts. The moral and religious problems that alchemy implicitly addresses were intertwined with the idea of the physical transformation of the metals. Jung believed the idea of transforming of metal into gold captured the passion and thereby the imagination of an alchemists. They described in their writings archetypal processes of transformation of the personality into integrated form in which its integrity was corrupted neither by inner or outer events. Jung called these processes individuation. Jung believed The writings of alchemists provided a window into processes of unconscious. He felt it described the psychological phenomenology observed in the unconscious, often with a detail he found astonished. The alchemists either projected their psychological content onto the base metal, or in later times, used the metals as a vehicle to describe the inner strivings. Jung also felt that alchemical writings provided a needed compensation to Christian doctrine. Most importantly for Jung, alchemical writings incorporated the bodily experience and the idea of evil, not just as a perversion of creation, but as an element of it. Jung felt that unification of opposites was the central problem in alchemy. The metaphor of the sexual unity of male and female is often used to illuminate the process because the most obvious opposition in the human experience. The symbol of sexual unity provides the image of the human being reconciling the opposites within. And in summary, alchemy mirrored the complexity of human psyche and provided for Jung insights into the processes of individuation. Jung and astrology. Jung argued that astrology also is a pre-modern form of the psychological science, and he was even known to consult horoscopes, natal charts, of his clients in the belief that this could reveal aspects of their personality and especially their unconscious motivations. Jung said that astrology represents the summation of the psychological knowledge of antiquity. And regarding its use in the clinical practice, he added, I must say that I very often found that the astrological data elucidated certain points which I otherwise would have been unable to understand. So it means that he'd been using practically astrological techniques. Jung attempted to provide a scientific basis for the use of astrology in psychology by advancing the theory of synchronicity based on Chinese I Ching, Book of Changes, which he styled as a causal connection principle, that anything happens is related to everything else that happens at the same time. According to Jung, the planets and zodiac represent universal principles reflected in aspects of human psychological makeup. There is connection or correspondence between the heavens and the structure and contents of the human psyche. Jung regarded the horoscope as an adjunct to more conventional modes of psychological analysis and a useful tool for therapists. And that's why actually we can say that modern development of astrology in the second part of 20th century was directly inspired by Jungian approach. Nowadays we have main centers of psychological astrology under Jungian psychological theory. So, and last question we have to discuss is relation Jung and phenomenology. Jung insisted that he worked strictly as empirical scientist and a phenomenologist, and used the term phenomenologist to underscore his commitment to the facts of experience apart from any metaphysical or philosophical judgment about them. However, his references to phenomenology are always passing remarks, and his phenomenology is never systematically developed. Some of his central concepts, such as collective unconscious or self, go far beyond what is given phenomenologically. Phenomenology's insistence that phenomena be integrated on their own terms was taken up by Jung, especially with regard to religious experience. He argued that the meanings of the images and rituals of religious experience should be analyzed in terms that do not violate the integrity of religious experience. Jung's method was generally a descriptive hermeneutics. It was a way of interpreting psychological meaning that stayed as close as possible to the phenomenon as it occurred. It was what Ricoeur called a hermeneutics of fate, unlike Freud's hermeneutics of suspicion. So, in other words, Jung did not want the study of religious experience to require an answer to the ontological questions or whether or not God exists. Jung wanted his refusal to step beyond experience into ontology to be understood as a humble respect for his epistemological limits as a psychologist. So, was Jung phenomenologist? Actually, Jung's understanding of phenomenology was superficial. From his disciplined phenomenologist perspective, Jung failed seriously to bracket his philosophical and specifically Cartesian assumptions adequately, with the result that his works fails phenomenologically at crucial moments. The problem for phenomenologists and most religious scholars is that Jung then claims that we do not perceive or relate to God as such, but only to the God image, which is interior to the psyche. The otherness of God was reduced to the purely logical and formal category of the Kantian noumenon, beyond all thinking, imagination, and relationship. However, whereas for Kant the phenomenal world of experience was still the open realm of experience and evidence, for Jung the phenomenal world was conceptualized as interior to the psyche. His theory of psychological types suggests that there may be constitutionally different ways of being a religious person, and that at least some of theological, ritualistic, and experiential differences may be typological. Finally, both phenomenology and Jung's analytical psychology have evolved over the years. A number of Jungians are phenomenologically sophisticated, and many phenomenologists have a greater appreciation of Jung's work. So now coming to conclusion, evaluation. First of all, appreciation of Jungian approach. Yes, Jung postulates that the man is in essence a religious, and that the religion is a native form of expression or attitude of the psyche. It's a positive element. Second, according to Jung, religion is important because it unlocks the collective unconscious, being therapeutic for an individual. Of course, he interprets religion as kind of therapeutics, but anyway, in positive sense. Again, differently than for Freud, for Jung, religion is not infantile, as it helps humans to mature and integrate their conflicting personalities. Religion gives life meaning. Religion can make people happy and provide support in difficult times when they could be prone to mental health problems. The concept of collective unconscious and theory of archetypes provided much more universal tools for analyzing the psychological aspects of world religions and especially mythological structures. And Jungian psychology enables the inter-religious dialogue. His dialogue with an openness to Eastern religious tradition. He has done more to interpret Asian religion to the West than any other scholar before him. Criticism. Many psychologists, especially in the United States academic field, have largely ignored him. Not because he deals with material that mystify or repel them, but also because he relies primarily on clinical and armchair techniques of research rather on experimentation and quantification. Secondly, Jung's staunchest critics accused him of either mystical or metaphysical essentialism. Since archetypes are defined in such mysterious way, and since archetypal images have been observed by many Jungians in essentially infinite variety of everyday phenomena, they are neither generalizable nor specific in a way that may be researched or demarcated with any kind of rigor. Anyway, can we prove existence of archetypes? That's one point of critics. Another criticism of archetypes is that seeing myth as universal tends to abstract them from the history of their actual creation and their unique cultural context, reduce cultural expressions to generic, decontextualized concepts. Many of his theological critics, as well as the historian of religions, have charged him with psychologism, the act of reducing religious experiences to intra-psychic processes. Again, misrepresentation and distortion of the doctrines, rituals, and images of religious traditions. For instance, famous scholar of religious studies Zenner says, he takes from religion only what confirms and illustrates his psychology. Good example, his commentaries on Kundalini Yoga, where he interprets yoga chakra system in opposite way, starting from Sahasrara at the bottom, because it helps him to apply his concepts. So it's easily to change Eastern traditions, just having such intention. Jung was trying to appropriate the authority of competing spiritual powers by transforming what was originally sacred and communal into a form that is both secular and individual therapy. As Harry Guntrip said, the narcissistic goal of individuation overlooks the essential role of personal relations in the attainment of integration. So actually, what is called privatization of religion, his impact was significant. Jung's refusal to make the paradoxes, antinomies, and complex symbols of religious language conform to the logic and conceptual terms of contemporary science, as well as his tendency to be unsystematic and obscure, have made him relatively inaccessible. As his scholar, biographer Peter says, many of Jung's writings are so mysterious that as almost undiscussable. Jung also was criticized by Western theologians for adopting a solipsistic view of God, and some monotheists argued that Jung's emphasis on the variation of the God image was essentially a new form of pagan polytheism. Definitely, Jung has shaped most of the contemporary New Age movement ideas. So, support, reconstructions, and so-called Jungism. The largest claims for empirical support, however, comes from the psychedelic LSD and non-drug holotropic therapy research of psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, whose finding lent, quotation, strong support for the existence of the collective unconscious and for the dynamic of archetypal structures. Jung's understanding of the nature of libido, his distinction between the ego and the self, recognition of the creative and prospective function of the unconscious, and the concept of individuation process. Yes, but this is on the basis of LSD. So we have to be careful, taking very much seriously this conclusion by Stanislav Grof. So his theories, Jungian theories, have been subjected to a friendly reconstruction to ensure compatibility with current scientific thinking, Shelbourne, for instance, or have been constructed as a psychological hermeneutics by Brown. Religious aura surrounds Jungian therapy. Even if religion considered as a therapy and Jungian therapy became a religion or esoteric cult, representing re-emergence of some aspects of Buddhism and Taoism in modern dresses. Actually, Noel even introduced this term Jungism to talk about particular ideology. becoming quite popular nowadays. But by the way, I can also mention one famous sentence by Jung himself, when he said at the end of his life, "Thanks to God, I am Jung, not a Jungian." So actually, it shows that he considered quite clearly a difference between his own attitude, interpretation, and approach, and his followers. So briefly, impact. Impact on various aspects: psychotherapists, artists, philosophers, even feminist theology. Some considered him as a stimulus for Christianity to renewal. Just to remember, Drewermann, famous German theologian. His influence was tremendous on Eranos meetings that were organized between 1933 to 1951 in Switzerland. Almost all stars of religious studies took part in these meetings. You see names: Zimmer, Heiler, Buber, Kerenyi, Neumann, van der Loof, Campbell, Eliade, Suzuki, Scholem, Tillich, and so on. You can say that some more or less impact of Jungian ideas was made here. Of course, they did not become Jungians, but still many ideas, Jungian ideas, were distributed here widely. So, his theories have been subjected to friendly development. So we can talk about post-Jungian approaches: classical approach, developmental approach, archetypal psychology, process-oriented psychology. All these developments provide a different interpretation of Jungian archetypes theories, stressing different aspects, different practical elements introducing. However, the basic approach is still called Jungian. So, and into concluding, for conclusion, finally, in 1959, 2 years before his death, Jung was interviewed for BBC television program. And he was asked if he now believed in God. He said, "Now, difficult to answer, I know. I don't need to believe, I know." So this, what we see again, this division between to believe and to know. But it is not the mission of psychology to comment upon God's existence. I know, but I cannot talk about this. So, and again, on his, and the entrance, above the entrance to Jung's house, there is a Latin inscription from the Delphi oracle: Vacatus atic non vacatus Deus aderit, summoned or not summoned, God will be present. So what it means actually, that I don't want to say that he himself was a religious person in a strictly Christian technical sense, but it shows that actually he at least was trying to be open to this issue. So I would like to conclude here. And sorry for taking so much time.
Perhaps any questions before we go to anyone?
Yeah, I would have a question.
Yes.
If you don't mind. Judging by the structure and proportion of your talk, you made it sound as if the Freudian approach is pretty much worthless, and the Jungian approach is pretty much the way to go. As a fan of Jungian analytic psychology, I myself am rediscovering Freud in the recent years. So I was wondering, what's your position?
Rediscovering what? Sorry?
Sorry?
Rediscovering what?
Rediscovering Freud.
Freud.
So my question to you would be, do you think there's something yet to discover in Freud that we may have sort of left unnoticed?
Yes, you see, actually my intention with this lecture was essentially Jungian approach to religious studies, but it is impossible to talk about Jung without introducing shortly a Freudian approach. But what I wanted to say that yes, still I consider Jungian approach to be much more fruitful in spite of these critics I provided and shortcomings, because Freud was never dealing, I'm talking about classical Freudian approach, with Asian religious traditions. And maybe you know, Guérin-Chakar-Bosset, the first Indian psychoanalytic who was in correspondence with Freud himself and who founded first outside of Europe psychoanalytical society in India. He said that he disagreed with many points regarding the religious issue with Freud, Oedipus, and so on, because we never can find this in India. What I wanted to say that those scholars who've been dealing or who wanted to apply Freudian approach for different religious culture, they, yes, I can say failed even. But it doesn't mean that it is impossible. And post-Freudian psychoanalytical, I just mentioned some schools, some developments, some personalities that are trying to do this. And, but still, one example, Jeffrey Kripal, famous American scholar of religious studies, he made some 2 decades ago famous work on famous Indian mystic Ramakrishna, and that was a big scandal in India because what he applied actually Freudian approach, more or less classical Freudian approach, and his intention even was to show that Ramakrishna was always having homoerotical fantasies and driven by homosexual instincts. All book that got an award of the best book of American Academy of Religion in 1998 probably. This is just example that still some, how to say, too narrow reductionist approach is probably evident. But I don't want to say that we cannot find new discoveries and new ways how to apply Freudian approach cannot be developed. It can be done, but still, I do not see so much done.
Sometimes a cigar is simpler.
Sometimes, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Exists an very interesting religious problem. Carl Gustav Jung and the unidentified flying objects.
Yeah, there is his separate book, paper on this, but again, he explained this in that understandable way. He locates this in our collective unconscious. The times come and suddenly everywhere in our corners of the earth we get a news about flying objects and so on. But he locates this in our deep collective unconscious. So I don't know how to say this. That only one his paper about this. It seems to me that his approach to astrology, to alchemy, to Gnosticism, it's really much more interesting than unrecognized flying objects because nobody before him took such serious interest trying to look from psychological perspective. So alchemy is not just making metal into the gold. It's a spiritual experience. So I consider this to be much more attractive, at least attractive approach. The same astrology as a source of psychological knowledge, why not? So I still continue my answering you also, but I cannot tell much about flying objects, sorry.
We can conclude for now. We've already been at it for a while. If anyone has any more questions, they can.
Yes, I see.
Was Jung Catholic or Lutheran or some other Protestant?
He was a Lutheran, and his father was a priest. This is a separate story of his childhood, what he experienced, how he was educated, how he became disappointed in Christianity, you can say, even in his early years. But that's separate topic. But as I said, he came to Christianity issue much later in his life. This square issue also reflects his attempt to reinterpret Christian worldview, especially metaphysics. But he was not if he was a Protestant, he was not a practicing, you can say sincerely. He never practiced yoga also because it's not good. It's dangerous. Well, I'm joking, but still I'm looking quite positively. So thank you very much.
Thank you.